To make the fretboard, I ripped another slice of the oak handrail on the table saw. Then I jointed one side and ran it through the thickness planer a few times to get it to its final thickness. I wanted to cut a small rebate joint in the fretboard for the nut to slot into. I did this on the cross-cut sled on my table saw. I did a first pass which gave me a cut the width of the blade kerf, and then moved it over by 1 or 2 millimeters and made a second pass, and that gave me a big enough groove for the nut to slot in nicely. Then I shaped the end of the fretboard beyond the nut to give it a curve on the belt sander. I then placed the fretboard on the neck with a mark down the centre of it so that I could position it central to the neck and the soundboard. I held it firmly in place and then traced the neck onto the back of the fretboard. Then I could cut away some of the excess material on the bandsaw following the line, but I left the two ends of the fretboard as they were. That's because it'll be useful for this material to be square when adding the frets and making sure all of the frets are square to the fretboard. Next I needed to work out the scale of my ukulele. I worked that out by basically marking up where the 12th fret would be, which would be roughly level with the heel of the neck. That measured 240mm from the nut, and by doubling that number, that meant that my bridge saddle would need to be positioned at 480mm from the nut, so I made a mark there too. On the Stuart MacDonald website there is a free fret calculator available to use, so I selected ukulele, put in my scale length, put in the number of frets, and then it gave me all of the specific locations for each fret in fractions of millimeters. I used a sharp pencil and plotted marks at each fret location as precisely as I possibly could. Next I glued a very thin and straight strip of pine ripped on the table saw to a piece of melamine with hot glue. I slid my fretboard against it and then hot glued another piece the other side of the fretboard. These two strips of pine had multiple functions. They'd hold the fretboard in place, they'd allow me to use a square to keep all of the frets straight, and they'd also allow me to gauge how deep each fret slot would need to be cut. I used my narrowest tenon saw to cut the fret slots, and a speed square to guide the cuts. I'd already cut a test slot on a piece of scrap to check that the fret wire would fit nicely in the slot, and luckily it did. With the fret slots cut, I wanted to make some fret markers, and I'd use a piece of mahogany for this to contrast against the light colour of the oak fretboard. I ripped a piece square on the bandsaw. I marked up where the fret markers would be, which for some reason was more difficult than it really should have been.
3, 5, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
I'd put a single marker on the 3rd, 5th, 7th and 9th fret, and a double marker on the 12th fret. I used an ice pick at the centre of each mark. Then I chose a drill bit that was slightly smaller than the square piece of mahogany and drilled them on the drill press. I marked up around the piece of mahogany and then I could just chisel out the rest of the material. And use a file to neaten it up. I chopped the mahogany into little pieces, added wood glue to each hole and then pushed them in place. Then I could seat them properly with a mallet before cleaning off the excess glue. Then I rubbed some sawdust in to fill any gaps. I could then cut out the rest of the shape of the fretboard to the size of the neck. I would need to keep the other end of the fretboard wide to hide the dovetail joint on the body, but I marked up a shape to make it look nicer. And then I cut that out on the bandsaw. Then I could use the belt sander to take off most of the excess material from the fret markers, and an orbital sander to get them all flush. I cleaned up the shape at the end of the fretboard with a round file. Then I could add all of the fret wire, cutting them to size with ordinary wire cutters as I went. A few of the slots were not cut quite deep enough, so I had to cut them a bit deeper. I made sure all of the frets were properly seated using a mallet. And I also squeezed them tight in a vise. Then I could chop off the excess fret wire with a hacksaw. I rounded over the edge of each fret. This should make the ukulele neck more comfortable to play. Then I could glue and clamp the fretboard onto the neck. I cleaned up the glue squeeze out before adding the extra clamps. I did a bit more shaping to the fretboard and the frets with an electrical file and an orbital sander.